So just taking a look at, what you say and what you've written, as far as what Zambia is doing, how is this different? Or let me ask, what is it that Zambia is doing which South Africa and other African countries are not doing, which has caused you to say that there are lessons that can be learned from Zambia?
Well, there are a number of things that I think are very important. The first one is about school, because we are in Africa, the youngest continent on the planet. So what that means is that we need to be looking carefully of how do we create opportunities for jobs, for learning, for income for the youth. That's really important in all countries in Africa, particularly ours. And so here in Zambia, one of the first commitments that was made by the president and his party was to remove school fees from both public primary schools and secondary schools. And he did it. And it's created a tremendous opportunity for a lot of poor households to deal with this. Now he's moving on and saying, we're going to add more teachers, we're going to add more schools, we're going to completely revamp the national curriculum to make it more modern and more appropriate. We're going to be linking more closely to the private sector to listen to them about the kinds of labor that they need and the skills and abilities that they need. So all of that is just one example of how things are changing for the better here.
And I ask that question because South Africa would, for example, argue that we've done that. Basic education is free to those who cannot afford it. And yet there is quite a huge debate about the actual quality of education that is delivered.
Hence the work that's going on here to revise the curriculum. Financial education has just been added as a curriculum item in the last year, so that kids can actually learn early on, what about money? How do I use it? How do I earn it? How do I manage my financial life to enable my family and myself to be better off and to have better opportunities? So these are just one example. There's also health hiring that's taking place. There's also a 5-fold increase in the allocations that go to communities for community development funds, along with the very careful crafting of all of the representatives of interests in communities, women, schools, people who are in religious environments. The churches have a voice. The traditional leaders, the chiefs have a voice in that process. And what we're seeing is it takes a little while to get this warmed up, but the money is going to things that people really want and need in communities.
So in saying that, of course, some would push back and say, but this government, this new administration has not been in office for very long. So when you assert this conviction, is it not too soon to be saying that this government is absolutely on the right path? Should we be waiting a little while longer to see how things actually pan out?
I think in Zambia, one of the things that does happen here is people are patient. So they're saying, okay, are things moving? Are they moving in the right direction? Have the commitments that the government made during the elections been actually started to be taking place? So the big ones are education, health, social cash transfers for the very poor, many of whom are women-headed households, activities to improve the infrastructure. You'll have seen that HH is frequently traveling to talk to his neighbors and the world internationally about, okay, let's talk about investment in Zambia. Let's talk about where we're going and how we're going to get there. The IMF program is now in play, which is very important. The discussions about the debt and the debt resolution are also well in play. So he's actually done quite a bit for a year.
Yeah, and then I guess, this is what we're looking at in terms of those lessons. But also, Betty, just you talk about the need for South Africa to make civil society formations effective. So what exactly is your view on South Africa's civil society at the moment?
I think that South Africa has major challenges because of its history. And it takes a while to get this stuff sorted out. I think that South Africans are making significant commitments. For example, South Africa has the 3rd best representation of women in national government in terms of the parliament and also in terms of the regional regional representatives. Of 10th best in the world, 3rd best in Africa. So there's 46% are women. This is a major, major achievement. And I think something of which South Africa can be very proud. It's an area where Zambia is still working on it, right? Here in Zambia, it's only 15%. So these kinds of issues are going to be important for Zambia to learn from South Africa. Where I think South Africa can learn from Zambia is things like informal enterprises and the transition.
So, but just as far as civil society organizations go in terms of lobbying for change within society, within government, how would you compare the two, the situation in Zambia versus what's happening in South Africa?
I think that in Zambia, we have a very wide representation of civil society. And women have been very active. Churches historically have been very active. The traditional leadership has been active and is becoming more active. So these kinds of representations exist. I think in South Africa, the circumstances are more political and they tend to be polarized a little bit more than they are here. So one of the things to learn is, how can we work together more effectively? How can we overcome our differences and align on the things that we think are most important and make those changes? And particularly in economic line.
So how do we become less politicized in that space when the changes that you are advocating for, that you're lobbying for, need to be made by those in political power in the main?
Well, let's look at the issues that I mentioned in the paper. One of the first ones is the question of informal enterprises. In South Africa, there's about 2.5 million workers and owners of completely informal enterprises, and they pay 850,000 workers. So that's a fair number of people. And so formalization of these businesses is a huge challenge across Africa. It's also a challenge in South Africa. The challenge of informal enterprises is they have low productivity, they pay less or no taxes, they are poorly governed, there's excessive regulations, and poverty. This is where the poor people sit, in informal enterprises. And what examples? You have spaza shops, you have people who are growing crops and selling them on the street, or traders who are selling on the street. And you have somebody who's cooking and then selling food on the street. So, and a large number of those people are women. So what do you want? You want them to be able to access services from the government. You want them to be able to access the most important thing, which is working capital. This is true across the entire continent. It's true in South Africa. So how do you transfer those companies? How do you help these people to formalize? And therefore, when you're a formal, it's a lot easier to go to a financial institution and say, I want working capital, here's my records. So there are ways to formalize. The government needs to push for this and say, how do we help you who are informal become formal, get information, get digitization, get working capital? Because those are the benefits. It's hard to see when you're in that chair, where can I go? How can I deal with this? And they end up borrowing from payday lenders, and then they can't grow their businesses in the same way. This is not only a problem in South Africa, it's also a problem in Zambia. But we're always working on how do we make the transition? What's important? That's part of the paper.
Betty, you also talk about the civil service, and you focus on that area. And South Africa is in the middle currently of a deadlock between some who believe what some believe can lead to a public service strike that the country can ill afford. But how should government then balance the disgruntlement of public servants who say that senior government officials are privileged, they earn massive wages, while ordinary workers are financially burdened with the high cost of living and debt and not seeing the same sort of increases that their seniors are seeing? How should government balance that?
It's a little bit of a different question than in Zambia, where the wages are much closer aligned. I think that the question of civil service that I wrote on was, how efficient is it? Are people getting the services they need? Are they getting them at a cost that is fair to the state? Are they getting the kinds of services that are necessary? If complaints exist from citizens, are those complaints being responded to in a timely and effective way? These are the kinds of things that are true everywhere. It's also true in Zambia. It's also true in South Africa. So what can you learn from Zambia? They're really working on becoming more responsive, dealing with financial ombud, having mechanisms for people to be more accountable for their work plans that are reported on and the spend reported on more effectively. These kinds of things are quite important. And so in your situation, what you're looking at is a differential between the civil servants as a group and the leadership as a group. And there are ways to look at that by simply comparing across Africa. What's the difference between a package for a minister and the package for, say, a director or your average staff? These kinds of things are commonly used in the private sector, comparables. And I will say that in the US, it's a huge problem because there are very, very high salaries at the top. And then at the middle, it's much less so. And it's creating a lot of discussion and a lot of consideration of how can you change it? What's the circumstances?
And then just finally, Betty, as we wrap this up, you also propagate that government must encourage smartphones, the use of smartphones to allow access to mobile money and access to information. So how are they doing this in Zambia?
Zambia has a problem with coverage, which has been dealt with by the government installing towers over the last 3 to 4 years. Then we have long distances away from things, but the government's also digitizing. So Smart Zambia in the cabinet office is saying, how do we digitize all these things in ways that people can access and use? And since we have young populations, people who are young are more likely to be able to be comfortable using a cell phone for mobile money, to access the government services, all of these kinds of things. And digitization, there's no way out. We have to do this. So doing it effectively and making sure people can access and use it is really, really important. And as smartphones become less expensive, as phones generally become less expensive, there's been distribution of cell phones to poor households, along with education on how do you use it, how do you call the market for prices, what about mobile money? And what we're finding is that if people have access to a phone, they use it and they use it for these purposes. And it makes a big difference in their lives.